Good rising, good afternoon, good evening, or good night. I am Tayla Andre. Waking up with Tayla Andre has absolutely nothing to do with the time of day we link up, but about waking up your third eye with unorthodox conversations leading to universal consciousness. Today is an amazing conversation because though universally we've been having the conversation about vaccines and, get the vaccine, get the vaccine. You guys know I'm not a vaccine shamer. You have to do what's best for your family. But I do have questions. And you guys do know who I am and how these children are raised. And so I do want to dig a little deeper for those that are skeptical, for those who will on a drop of a dime talk about the Tuskegee Experiment, talk about how the system has never been for us and why should we trust them now. And so for all of those that have been labeled conspiracy theorists, but you guys have concerns and rightfully so. Let's get your questions answered because I know I have a million. With us today is Dr. Charles Anderson, who is a pediatrician, and Dr. Keith Motley. What's the correct pronunciation?
Oh, it's Motley.
Motley. Okay.
Motley, yes.
And so please introduce yourselves and thank you for your time. I know you both are so busy.
Sure. Well, I'm, again, as you mentioned, my background clinically is in pediatrics and newborn intensive care. I've been in Boston for about 30 years. Started my clinical experience here at what was Boston City Hospital, and I still call it Boston City Hospital. I'm currently the CEO and the president at the Dimock Center, and been there since January, and love to talk and engage people in this process of deliberating what's a really complex decision about vaccine and what it means to you as an individual, your family, and our community.
And good morning or good evening or whatever time it is that we are able to engage with you. As was said earlier, I'm Keith Motley. I'm so honored to be here. I'm the Chancellor Emeritus and a professor in the College of Management at the University of Massachusetts in Boston, but also have been someone who's been working tirelessly in this community here in Boston for over 40 years. I'm currently serving as consultant, CEO, and president of the Urban League of Eastern Massachusetts, and have been very, very active and engaged for a long time with the Dimock Community Health Center, which, Dr. Anderson is now the president of. I also serve, in full disclosure, as one of his street team members, as one of the people who serve to talk about vaccination out in the community on behalf of Dimock and its great president leader.
I love the affirmations of just both of you affirming each other. So hard questions. I want to start at the beginning because there's a lot of people that don't know the history and just say Tuskegee Experiment because it was a meme that they saw on Instagram. What is the history of the said Tuskegee Experiment, the Guatemalan experiment, what took place in Ecuador, like just different medical research that was unethical that used people of color over the years?
Yeah, well, let me start off with that one. I think the unfortunate thing is that you were able to rattle off several of them, right? I mean, that is the unfortunate thing. Right. When you think about it, it's bad enough that it happens once in one country. But when this is happening across the globe with such consistency, that's an ultra atrocity. But let's talk specifically about the Tuskegee Experiment. I'm not going to get into all the fine details, but I will say this. Imagine, back in the 1940s-ish, that you're a black man and you have syphilis. And you're not even told that you have syphilis. There's a treatment for syphilis, but you're enrolled in something that's going to allow the government to study the natural history of what happens to someone who has syphilis and not treated, right? And imagine that doesn't just go on for 5 years, 10 years, etc. But imagine that goes on for 40 years, right? And all of the advances and everything that's happened, and you're not provided access to those things that could significantly improve your life and your family's life. That's what that experiment was about. And the unfortunate part about it as well is that it targeted Black men and, quite honestly, affected their whole families, right? But that also affected the way all of our families think about the healthcare institution, right? We don't think about the healthcare institution naturally as something that's there to provide us care. There's been experiment after experiment that has led many of us to think about it as something where we're guinea pigs. We're to be experimented on, and we're not thought of and treated as humans. And that is what the body of all of these experiments and atrocities really are, in my mind.
Dr. Motley, do you want to pick up on that?
I will pick up on it. I mean, so one of the reasons I love coming on to this show was, not only are you talking about keeping it real, but you allowed for some education around where historically we've been and how we now have this implanted in our mental model when it comes to just the word experiment. And Black folk, we automatically go to Tuskegee, and then you name all these other spaces in the world. I can't sit here and say that when I heard about vaccines being developed and everything else, that wasn't immediately where I went to in my own frame of reference or my own mental model. And so it took me being in conversations during this entire period, conversations with competent leaders who I trust, like Dr. Anderson and others, and then looking at the research that has been done to this point, particularly by people like Dr. Corbett and others who were in this battling for us as Black people, that made it easier for me to at least begin to think about it. So this wasn't something that I came to immediately. It was something that, after looking and considering where I had come from in my own historical navigation period, which is filled with those kind of stories, right, as a Black man, to where I wanted to be able to be a reference for this community, then also having the kind of individuals in my life who could help give me the kind of confidence that the Dr. Andersons of the world have done by sharing information and allowing me to digest it and then come to a decision around that. So I appreciate that you started here, and got that right out of the way early for us.
Of course, this entire platform is about educating and making sure that we are properly informed, and then being able to make informed decisions. That's my platform across the board, is making informed decisions, regardless of what your decision is, anything. And so I titled today's conversation on vaccines, though we're speaking about COVID-19 vaccine. I do want to, for those who do not know, I have 3 children. I have a soon-to-be 18-year-old, a soon-to-be 16-year-old, and a current 2-year-old. My 2-year-old walked out of the hospital with a vitamin K shot, which is like the bare minimum of why. Like, he walked out the hospital with almost nothing. And so, Dr. Anderson, clarify for me, or just confirm for me, that vitamin K just makes sure that his blood is good, his blood was strong, and there's like no clotting. Because that's how it was explained to me, when it was just like, well, you might want to just get the vitamin K at the least.
Sure. Well, I think the important thing that you describe is it's vitamins. It's a vitamin, right? It's not a vaccine. It's vitamin K. And vitamin K is important for clotting. And babies and newborns tend to be vitamin K deficient, right? So think about like if you're giving somebody any other vitamin supplement. That's what that was. It was not a vaccine. Now, that said, I'd be curious to know, though, just exploring, because this is a great platform to have these conversations. And so I don't want us to miss any of the opportunities here. So I'm going to ask you some questions, too.
Okay.
Tell me about your thought process. As when you were thinking through the decision about would it be vitamin K versus other vaccines, how did you arrive to where you were?
So I was a young mom. Anari was born when I was 20, Asaria when I was 22. And I was approximately 24, 25 when they received their last vaccines. And it was something in me that day that was like, this is the last day. That I can't explain. It was just like my soul took me in a completely different direction. And that was honestly the day that I fell down the rabbit hole of like due diligence. And what does this mean? That was the last time that I purchased whole milk for my family. We switched over to almond milk. It was a lot going on for me during that time where I made a lot of different decisions. And as I got older, having conversations with my elders, and anybody who's over 40 has that mark on their right hand, on their right arm, that like all 18 vaccines at one time.
It wasn't quite that bad. Come on now.
Right? Yeah. Come on now. You trying to make it seem so old school.
You guys have one, right? Hope y'all have one.
Hey, you get personal now. You get personal now. I want you keep telling your story.
Yeah.
And so I recognize that the vaccine schedule has altered over the years, and it took a turn around the same time that the food industry took a turn, and it was in the mid 70s where the food industry was now like propagandized and was just used for more so profit than for people. And understanding lobbying and the pharmaceutical company and vaccine court, for me, it just wasn't enough. It wasn't enough safety and security for me and my family, because if the worst was to happen, I would be battling the United States government for years on end, like many families still are in vaccine court. And so it wasn't something that I was willing to take the chance of. And people are like, well, your kids could get smallpox and your kids can get chicken pox. And, I had the chicken pox vaccine and I got chicken pox and I didn't die. And so I understand that a lot of the vaccines that we give our children today were not a part of what my mom received at 37 years old, wasn't a part of what I received. And I just thought, like, as far as long-term side effects, there were just so many alterations in the mid 70s where the profit was over people. And I felt more secure in taking proper precautions in the form of feeding my kids the foods in which they needed that would supplement what the vaccines were doing, in the sense of like a lot of, as of the last article that I read, Haiti has not received one dose of vaccines. Not one vaccine has been administered into Haiti. I read that article, I want to say maybe 14 days ago. Maybe there's been updates since then, but they also have one of the lowest death rates. Reading through the comments, a lot of people are joking that it's the muscatique oil, but it's like the old school remedies that are bringing people back. When I'm speaking to friends and family here in the United States that have contracted COVID-19, whether they received the vaccine or didn't receive the vaccine, they too have used these old school remedies, which is nothing more but the preventative maintenance that we should be engaging in every day in the form of eating our vitamins and eating our nutrients instead of having foods that have a whole lot of calories and nothing in them for supplements.
Well, this is a good. We can talk about this for hours, but let me also start with just this one ground rule. My role here isn't to convince you or to change your mind.
Exactly.
My role here is for us to have this exploration of how we arrive at certain decisions, right? Because I think everybody has their own path in this. I think one of the big things that you highlighted for me was just how difficult it is to get good information and to define what is good information, right? So we all get some information and we try to sort that out and we try to make it relevant for ourselves. And I think we've been challenged there in terms of how we've done that. But let me share another part of this. It becomes really important. You actually talked about where you were at that point in your life. When the School of Public Health here at Harvard did a study to try to understand, quote unquote, vaccine hesitancy. And I don't like to call it that. I like to call it vaccine confidence. But when they did the study to understand that, when it related to COVID vaccine, what they found after they looked at all these different things that they thought might contribute to vaccine hesitancy, the single most powerful and only real statistically significant variable was, and this is asking 3,000 people, right, about these things. They ask things like, do you think you're at risk of getting COVID? Do you think you're at risk of dying? They ask all these different questions. The only thing that was statistically significant was an experience of racial discrimination, right? An experience of racial discrimination. And what that reminds me of is that all of us have a lens through which we view information and data, and we use that to make decisions. My only concern is that if I've been given a lens, right, that has been clouded in a certain way, that has been adjusted in a certain way, am I able to see the information and digest it in a way that allows me to have an equal chance of coming to the same conclusion, right?
And I think that's where I struggled initially with this whole process, because quite frankly, as we were going through several of the conversations along the way to vaccination, you know, when the first people I was on calls with who happened to be physicians and happened to be in the same circle as Dr. Anderson and I, and they were just raising the bar on just my anxiety around lots of this. You got to do this. You have to social distance. You got to wear a mask. You can't do this. And one mask is not enough. And clean your hands and this and that. You can't go visit your mama. You can't do this. You can't do that. Well, I was sort of very hesitant because I went back to the historical context. I was coming from a certain lens. And then one day it just dawned on me that all these credible individuals were giving me information that I could consider. And here we are. So, you know, I agree with you wholeheartedly, Dr. Anderson. When you think about that lens, you know, I found myself having to navigate from there to here, you know.
And I should point out, those instances of racial discrimination were not necessarily healthcare related.
Right.
There were people talking about their experience with the police, their experience with their employers, et cetera, et cetera. These are all the things that I think when we talk about the real impact, when we talk about social justice and inequity, these are some of those things, right, that put us in a position where our ability to evaluate something is different. Not right or wrong, but it's different. Because I can tell you, when Reggie Lewis opened up and you saw who was coming from all the suburbs and everything to get vaccinated,
right?
Think about it. And that was very interesting. And some of those people were also people who would fall in that category. Well, I don't vaccinate my kids. I don't do all the rest of this. But they had a different lens through which they were looking at this experience. And so what we try to do at the Dimock Center with our street team, quite honestly, is I don't spend a lot of time talking about all the science and all the rest of that. We can do that if you'd like.
Right.
But what I've tried to do is I've tried to let people tell their stories, right? So it's important for me to have people say, look, this is where I was about this. I struggled with this. And some say, but you know what? I weighed these things and I just want to get back to my normal life. I want to be able to get on a plane and see my grandkids. And that was part of how they made their decision. And other people had other things. Other people said, look, I saw all these people who didn't look like me rushing down to Roxbury to get vaccinated. And I said, okay, I don't want to miss out, right?
Mhm.
I mean, everybody has a different path into this, and I think that's really important.
So we do have a question from the audience. I'm not going to say his name, but could you please explain the constant push to have everyone from pregnant women to elderly in hospice care vaccinated against SARS-CoV-2 that doesn't affect 99% of mankind?
So I'm sorry, the question again was everybody who's pregnant and
just the push.
Oh, he's just saying everybody. He's saying, I guess he's saying, why are we pushing to have everybody vaccinated if the COVID doesn't affect more than 1% of people, right? And that's what he's saying. And here's the thing about viruses and about virology, is that viruses only have one reason for living, and that is to replicate. So that's what they do, right? The challenge is when they do replicate, oftentimes little things go wrong, right? And as they replicate, sometimes that thing going wrong makes them more virulent, which means they're more infectious or makes it more dangerous, right? They're more likely to kill people, right? And it's those variants that we're talking about now that become incredibly concerning. So the more this virus bounces back and forth, because there's a difference between someone getting infected and getting sick and hospitalized and dying, and someone who just is now allowing the virus to be passed back and forth to the point that it gets to a variant that is so difficult to manage and can potentially have so much more impact. I'm particularly concerned about our communities right now with what we have, because we know that as a Black man, I'm 2.5 times more likely to get to die if I get this thing, right? And I'm 1.5 times more likely to get it, and 4 times more likely to be hospitalized. And that's just looking at the data today. But the reality is, some of this push to get vaccinated is to say, look, we got to make sure this thing doesn't get more out of control. It's already killed, 500,000 people in the U.S. alone, right? So we've got to get this under control. That's the concern.
Mm-hmm. And so, devil's advocate. Well, this whole show is a devil's advocate.
That's all right.
When it comes to, like, when we look at breast cancer, when we look at all of these other diseases that have taken more lives over a shorter period of time, why the push for a vaccine when we're not pushing as hard for prostate cancer, breast cancer, heart disease, hypertension, like all of these other things that are affecting more people at rapid numbers compared to COVID, but yet you've never seen this type of aggressive attack towards it.
Mm-hmm. So that's, there's a lot in that question, right? But let me say this: the first part, in terms of when you talk about a virus that is transmitted the way this is transmitted, it reminds us that it's very different when you're talking about infectious diseases and diseases like cancer. So let's say non-infectious diseases. Both incredibly important, different strategies for managing them, right? But both incredibly important. I think part of the push around this is because the pandemic nature of it, right? So this is worldwide, impacting many, many lives, impacting not just lives from the standpoint of the deaths and sickness, but also impacting lives in terms of the economic conditions. Especially in communities like we serve here at the Dimock Center, but all around globally as well. So I think that's driven a lot of this heightened level of concern and focus. Also understanding viruses are things that can get out of control so quickly, right? We see this in India right now, right? It can just get incredibly devastating really, really quick, and some of it around these variants. Now, that said, we do need to do more around things like prostate cancer. We absolutely do, because I put that in the category of no one should die of prostate cancer.
Right.
No one. No one should die of prostate cancer. It can be diagnosed early enough, screened in, and it can be managed, right? So to your point, I would say it's not a either or. We need to be doing both. And hopefully coming out of this, quite honestly, we'll have a heightened level of energy and resources put into understanding that we do need to address all of these major public health concerns.
And there should be a heightened level of, on the work that Tom Farrington and his group are doing around Black men and prostate cancer. And in that community, there is a heightened awareness, but we need to get this even more highlighted as we move forward.
But that's a great example of these other things that affect the lens.
Right.
And that's why I don't want us to lose sight of this, because we have to ask ourselves, I think it's really important for us at this stage of where we are as Black and brown communities, we need to ask ourselves, how much of that lens is something that somebody gave me that I've got to figure out how to at least take up for a minute to be able to see things differently, right? How much of that lens is creating more inequity and differential access, right? Give you an example. Let's talk about cancer, right? One of the things around cancer and prostate cancer is screening, right? One of the biggest challenges that we have when it comes to prostate cancer screening, especially when it required, an exam that men weren't excited about, we thought about that even more differently in our community, right? The idea of a doctor putting their finger in it and blah, 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 we're like, we're just like, nah. We thought about it differently. And it impacts our willingness. And again, I want to be very clear about this. This is not about, and this is why I talk about this in terms of it's about confidence building. It's not about hesitancy, right? It's all these other things that factor in the way we think about this that impact our willingness, our confidence in the way we're going to be treated to step forward and get access to the screening and everything else that we need. And then once we get the screening and once we get the lab results, now to access the procedure, which we have a whole other set of things the way we think about it. And it doesn't help, quite honestly, that the person that you're probably going to see when you have any type of cancer is not going to look like you. Right? Let's be clear. There is lots of data to support the fact that I'm going to be much more open to what that doctor suggests I need to do when that doctor looks like me and has a shared experience to me, and I can have a different type of conversation. So these are all the things that do need to be addressed, not only when we think about vaccine and COVID, but when we think about health and health disparities, and how do we make sure that everybody not just has equal access, but that those of us who need that extra bit, right, because of this lens that's making it difficult for us to have the same view, how do we make sure that that happens?
And I'm sure that's one of the reasons why you developed your street team of individuals to go out and at least help get a T on the word trust for lots of people in the community that were trying to determine whether or not to take the next steps.
Yeah, that's it. Exactly right.
So my next question is about, so from 2019 to 2020, we saw 39 to 56 million illnesses of the flu. 410 to 740 hospitalizations, and over 62,000 deaths of adults and 195 deaths of children. And this is just 1 year, but those numbers are increased tenfold if you do 2 years, 3 years. Why it's not a mandatory, we don't push the flu shot like we push the COVID-19. What is the difference between what seems like the flu? Because in the beginning, my family, we swear we got COVID back in February of 2020. Because we were a family, we never get sick. When we do get sick, it's over for us. And so we got sick and it was bad. And everybody in the house was sick, I want to say, for a good 3 days. And then we were done. And it was something that we never experienced before. It wasn't a typical common cold. It wasn't the sniffles. It wasn't sneezing. It was like real being sick. And we've never, ever, none of us have ever received a flu shot, but God bless us, we haven't experienced anything throughout COVID either. So the question more so is why do we see this huge push for the COVID? But it's like, if you don't get the flu shot, people aren't shaming you, but you don't get the COVID shot. It's like shame, like how you're putting me at risk. Don't come to my house. But if we're in the height of flu season and I didn't get my flu shot, you still invite me to Christmas dinner.
Well, let me answer that in a couple ways. One is that, and this is the challenge with epidemiology, right? You can look at these numbers. And I remember in the NICU telling people about the percentages and chances of this. If you're that one, the numbers, the percentages and stuff don't even matter, right? One of the first 1,000 people to die of this disease was one of my best friends in the world, Gary Jenkins, DJ buddy back in college, DJ post-college, etc. I mean, we had known each other since I was 16 years old, right? And I still remember that text message or that phone call from when we landed in the emergency room 2 days after he just got married, and died 5 days later. And it was clear that this was COVID, right? So statistics all fine, but here's one person that I knew very, very well who passed away related to this virus, right? So to me, I made that connection immediately that this was real and it was serious, right? Others might have had a different experience, but for me, it was real and it was serious. If you're sitting where the medical community does, you look at this as well from that same standpoint. The numbers are evolving. So you're right in the middle of this thing, how it's going. He was one of the first 1,000. Now we have 500,000 people who passed away due to this. All you know is that you have something that is going to be difficult to control. And you do know that this is something that the variants are going to be the biggest challenge. And it's going to be harder if this does come to the point where it's killing many, many more people, infecting many more people, and goes from something that in some and most might seem like just a common cold to now being something that's much more devastating, because as this virus mutates, it has the potential to become much more devastating. And let's remember, it's not mandated right now, right? The flu shot is not mandated either, but the reality is in certain areas, I mean, we were pretty clear in hospital community, you got the flu shot. And it was not necessarily just to protect you as a healthcare provider. Matter of fact, that was the least of the concern, although it was a concern. The bigger thing was how you protected your patients, right? If you're running around with the flu and you interacted with someone who was going to be more susceptible to getting the flu and potentially dying, it was our responsibility as healthcare providers to make sure that that didn't happen. So this stuff is very, very complex, but I would encourage everyone, be careful about over-interpreting the numbers in either way, right? This is one that I really think is really important for people to tap into their own feeling about where they are on this and what it means to them. Be very careful, because that all you need is that one, right? And if you're that one, God forbid, or someone you love is that one,
right,
the numbers and statistics don't even really matter.
And so Mike, good rising, Mike, how are you? So Mike is an avid listener of the show. He asked, does the vaccine cover the latest strands?
Yeah. So what's being investigated right now would suggest that the strands that we're seeing, the UK variant, Brazil variant, et cetera, seem to be fairly well covered by the current vaccines. Now, that said, the vaccine developers are already trying to make sure that they are thinking about these new strains and already starting to develop vaccines that might be even more powerful against some of these emerging strains. But right now, the general message from the public health community, from the CDC, is that the current vaccines seem to be effective in managing and protecting us against the strains we're currently seeing today.
And so I want to be fair and ask questions that I don't even understand the context to. And so one of the questions we currently have is the gain of function. And so this is a two-part question. Aside from F. Bill Gates, in the beginning, this was possibly man-made. And I'm not sure what gain of functions is or gain of functions research, and so I cannot speak to it. But the fact that it is assumed that this pandemic was created by man, could you please speak to that? And if you know anything about gain of function, can you please speak to that as well?
I don't. Matter of fact, I was just Googling this gain of function research because I have not heard anything about that. So I don't know if the question here is about whether or not this was man-made or I'm trying to understand the question, as I think you probably are also.
As well, yes. PBG, if you could re-ask that question, I would love that. But I know that they did their research. I've read all the articles. They refused to go into the medical facility or the research facility. They went straight to Wuhan, into the marketplace. So for me, they've been doing this for years, like thousands upon thousands of years. They've had marketplace. I recently went to Ethiopia. I was in Makato. I saw like lamb and goats heads being chopped off right next to the limes and the garlic salt. Like everything is together. This is the culture and has been the culture for thousands of years. And so to say today, because of the way we've been doing things in our culture, unsanitary wise, this is how the pandemic was started. Was for me like that. It just didn't sit. Like they've been doing this for years. Now all of a sudden they crossed, and now we have this this virus. What are the probability? Like, what is the probability of this being man-made, and not just to the point of COVID-19, but to the AIDS was man-made, and like all of these other things that we've never believed came out of God's hands.
Yeah. Again, that's hard for me to speak to because I'm not sure that let's put it like this. Your first bit about, can a virus emerge out of marketplaces and things like that? I mean, the reality is viruses, as I mentioned, viruses are around. They're around us all the time. Sometimes they mutate as they do what they do because they're very simple organisms. They really, really are, right? And as they do what they do and replicate, things go wrong, things happen. And then what evolves over time is sort of a selection for viruses that are better at infecting people. Now, really, really, really smart viruses do that and don't kill people, right? Because you kill the host and then you're done. So there are viruses out there, and there are viruses that are important for our everyday life as well. And part of how viruses get around is where people crowd together. So is it the animals and things in the marketplace? Is it the fact that that's just where a lot of people come together? Are there viruses that start out in humans and go to animals, which we do see, and does some go back and forth? And does the animal have to be live? It might depend on the virus. There's all these permutations of it that are unclear. But the fact is, we do know that viruses are around in our world and have been since the beginning of time and will always be. And occasionally, unfortunately, something's going to go wrong with one of them. And it's going to lead to something that's infectious. And there's going to be different degrees of infection, right? Ebola, for example, is a really good extreme example of infection, but also of a not very smart virus because You get that, you're dead, right? But the reality, so that's the first part. This question about man-made, there's always the concern that people are, doing all types of crazy things in this world, right? And nothing surprises me anymore. That said, I don't have any direct information or knowledge to say one way or another, but I will say we live in a crazy, crazy world, right? And what I would implore people is be careful of not falling into the crazy or being part of the crazy, right? And that's where shows like this are so important. Let's talk about these things, right? But understand that there's a lot of stuff going on out there that we all have to try to constantly filter through. But ultimately, we have to face the situation we're in and make a decision, right? Whatever that decision is, we have to be very vigilant about making a decision. My biggest concern, quite honestly, Taylor, are those who are saying, I just don't want to make a decision, right? Because that's why shows like this and things are important. We need to have more conversation because I'm fine whatever decision you make, but I want to make sure that we're doing what we can to give people what they need to do the appropriate deliberations to be able to make a decision, because we do know that there are people we're connected with that our decision will impact them, right?
So I'm really excited that we not only have an MD, but we have a doctor in business. And so when we took a look at the Spanish flu, going back to history, once you understand history, you can understand the present. Going back to the Spanish flu, we soon saw the entire economy crash. It seems like the economy is booming because right now a two-family in Roxbury is $1 million. So I don't think our economy isn't crashing anytime soon. But I recently did an interview with NESMS, talking about how the pandemic affected my real estate business and, what the effects on female business owners or just women in general, since we were the most affected. For the most part, men are doing well statistically. They didn't lose their jobs at a higher rate as women. They are able to get back into the workforce at a higher rate as women. And so what are the effects of women in the workforce, and what are the long-term effects as far as like finances, retirement, savings, childcare, whether they're going to go back to work or not. And so all of these are like real conversations that we're having. And I want to know from a business standpoint, what do you see are long-term side effects of the COVID-19? And everybody, we know all these statistics, or maybe the viewers don't know all the statistics. But when it comes to women, and when it comes to Black women, and when it comes to people of color in general, we're seeing that, as always, we are left out and not reaping the benefits that our counterparts are. And so what do you see as far as 5 years from now, even 18 months from now? Do you predict the economy to crash? Do you predict, the economy to what are your predictions as far as business is concerned?
Well, listen, you know that there's a saying that when our community always catches more than a cold, or it catches more than whatever the latest challenge is, and it's always been that way for us. When you talk about income inequality, you're talking about businesses in the community, and the fact that even in good times, lots of business fail. So when we are very heavily in a consumer business that requires people to be either in restaurants or whatever it is, requires people to have to transition, we're going to have financial challenges going forward. I would like to be in your business right now. You talked about real estate. That's one of the greatest places in the world to be as a business person now, given the rates, given the fact that, sales and all those kinds of things. So, it's a matter, the challenge is going to be there for our community going forward. But I think we have learned to pivot. We've learned to make the kind of transitions that we need to move forward and to stay intact. So, you answered most of the question by when you asked your question, because you gave all of the kind of facts.
So no, the
to
economy is not crashing anytime soon.
Well, listen, the goal is, in our community right now, there are quite a few challenges. However, I'm not going to sit here and predict doom. The goal is to do everything that we can not to allow that to happen.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and also just understanding that we want to make the recovery be
Right.
as even as possible, right? So it's one thing you spoke to the business owners and the disproportionate impact on especially our minority women-owned businesses, right? And what are the things we need to do to support that category of businesses coming back? Well, let's also talk about the people who are unemployed, right? You got to remember that only 14% of people who lost their jobs during this pandemic were people who made over $100,000 a year. 40% of those are people who made less than $40,000 a year, right? What type of jobs are going to come back, right?
And Dr. Anderson, let me just say, our goal is not to return to the good old days.
Right. That's my point.
Because the good old days weren't good old days for us. I'm happy when you told me before this show the choices you had made about how you're transitioning your life and you're getting into a business that's going to really be productive in the future. This gives us a chance to reflect and do some things that we never thought of doing before. On a personal level, it's allowed me to do some things I never thought of doing before, in business and those kinds of things. So we have to think differently, and we have to approach life differently, as we go forward. And it's not about status quo. Mm-hmm. It's not about, this notion of, I hope we can get back to normal. What normal wasn't so good in a lot of cases for folks. So I don't want that normal. Okay, I want to be able to move forward and think differently and do differently and act differently and build differently and do the things that we were talking about doing for so long. When you talk about all of the things we tried to describe in the Guza Saba and its principles, right? Well, this actually put some of that to work and to do it well. And one of the reasons I could sit back today and allow you just to absorb the mind of a giant like Dr. Anderson, right? And let him answer all the questions that we didn't come on today thinking we were answering those questions. We came on to talk about how this community could at least have an alternative way of looking at that. But we're willing to do it because you got a giant like that who has the capacity to do it. So if you ever want to know why I went from way over here to the right or left of this issue and got centered in it, it's because I had people to help build my confidence like that. So we have to think differently. We cannot allow ourselves to be mired in this notion of what it was. What it was wasn't so good for you or me. So we need to fix that. And so I think we have the opportunity to do it going forward.
Yeah, and that's so important. I mean, that's where I was going. I'm glad you took it right there, because the reality is it shouldn't look like it did.
Right.
For the communities we care about,
it doesn't,
because that wasn't working. But we need to make sure that we are engaging the resources to get to this new place, right? The conversations that are about how we leverage the amazing opportunities at universities and colleges and some of the other type of training programs that we need to be doing, partnering with companies doing things around cybersecurity and what that's going to mean. We need to really, really be looking at how we completely think differently in health, in wealth, in politics, because all these things are the determinants of the future of your 2-year-old and my 14-year-old.
Right.
Right. And I look at this, I often describe where we are right now as this 1965 moment. Now, I only happen to be 3 years old at the time, but the reality is that something happened because of all that was happening. Right. But that something happened because people came together and said, no, we're going to change this. This is going to be different. Voters' Right Act happened. All the other things that happened. Matter of fact, federally qualified community health centers, the Community Health Center Project started then as a way to say, look, healthcare ain't working for Black and brown communities. It's got to be different. Right. So that was the emergence of this. What is going to emerge from this 1965 moment? Right. And that's something we have to be very, very thoughtful about. And I think, Dr. Motley's addressing it perfectly. It can't be saying we're going to go back to what we had because that wasn't working. But are we organizing to make sure that we're creating something new? Right. It's the partnerships. It's part of why I came on board here at the Dimock Center, and I'm engaging with, good friends like Dr. Motley and others to say, how do we work together to do this differently?
And like Tayla, when you started out, you gave us some great context historically. Don't ever forget those things. When we're searching for this new, don't forget the old. Just don't be so caught up in the old, that we end up stuck there. We can't be stuck. We have to sort of try to figure out how to move to make that difference. So that's what I'm excited about. I'm excited about you and the fact that, here we are. And I saw your 2-year-old running around and, what's it going to be like for him? That's what we're battling for. Because remember, this has never been about us. Although many of us are so selfish to think it is about us. It's about all those. Dr. Anderson's not working tireless hours just for himself to survive. He's looking at those children and having a base in, pediatrics. I mean, I know he understands that. When I'm here educating people, it's not about all my contemporaries. It's about that 2-year-old you had running around. That's why I told you, let him cry, let him do what he wanted to do, because it gave me a chance to talk to him and learn from him and see what a 2-year-old in an environment with you would act like. So think differently, about our spaces and what we're going to do. Now, I know this has been a very interesting journey for us today, but I do know that while it's not something that everyone right now is on board with, I know that a lot of folk have gotten on board with this notion of being part of this vaccine, the people that are vaccinated, because there's so many things that are valuable to us as individuals in our lives that we want to pull back, and be able to go forward too, including our loved ones. Many of us have elderly parents. My mother, you talk about flu shots. She never took a flu shot in her life. However, she thought about it and she took her second vaccine and, will be ready to see all of her children soon. I mean, this is just the way it is. So in some of our communities and some of our families. But I know that we're going to be closing soon.
Yes.
And I'm sorry that you got me fired up on that last issue. But it always bothers me that people try to act like what was cool enough for us as a people.
I love it.
You're right.
And that bothers me because that's not what it is. I don't want that. I never want that for our students. I don't want it for us. I don't want it for you.
Yeah.
Okay.
So I want to try and really quickly, because we are coming to the top of the hour. I wanted to get in the fact, 2 questions. So why is it that we're seeing that young people are not catching COVID at all? Like it's like one baby caught it in Minnesota, or like one teenager in Arkansas, but we're not seeing numbers of young people. And what is it? Is it like just the resilience of their immune system? Like, how is it that they're damn near immune, but the rest of us are at risk?
Well, I mean, we've seen this multiple types of viruses, right? It affects different people, different age group, probably primarily around age group differently. And that's not, so you have the flu, etc. The thing I'd be careful about, though, is that if you talk to Dr. Churchwell, who you really should get on as well, he's a brother who now is, incoming president at Children's Hospital, and he'll tell you they've taken care of lots of really sick kids, and they've had some deaths related to COVID. So there's a whole syndrome that we're seeing in kids, and actually it was first actually identified in the UK. And interesting enough, around kids who were of Caribbean descent, Black kids, and they had something that was similar to another disease we called Kawasakis disease. And it's basically where you have this, it's kind of an autoimmune disease. It triggers this autoimmune response where the kid's body is attacking its own body, right? Is treatable as a Kawasaki's disease, but, has been really devastating in the handful of cases, and more than a handful of cases, quite a few cases. So we're still trying to understand what this means, and we still don't understand the long-term effects. So a kid might have it, be asymptomatic, but we don't know what that's going to mean for them 2 years from now, 3, without the time will tell. We've had diseases in the past, like something we call rheumatic fever, which was just like a strep infection, that then after we noticed over years, even though kids were asymptomatic, as adults, they have mitral valve, they have heart conditions related to it. So let's be clear. I mean, when viruses get in, they replicate and they damage cells. We don't know completely what that all means. So asymptomatic does not necessarily mean that it's not going to be an issue. And also, I don't want to leave your listeners at all thinking that there aren't kids who've been significantly impacted by this. Yes, fewer numbers, but I go back to, you're that one. It doesn't matter. And one thing I do want to share before we close is really important, because Dr. Motley mentioned this. And, part of my journey at this point, having been vaccinated, I can honestly say I like to play golf. When this whole thing broke, I wasn't getting on a golf course. I got tired of things. I was like, look, I'm not going to be that one Black guy out there who's going to get infected and end up in the hospital. Y'all run around not wearing masks and all. I didn't want anything to do with it. Got my second vaccine, month and a half, whatever ago. I actually got on the golf course last week, and it felt really good. I've had a couple breakfasts, small group, one other person, they're vaccinated, mask off, eating breakfast. It felt good. Right. There was something about it to me that I'm like, wow, I can breathe again. Right. Everybody's experience is going to be different, but that's my experience. I really feel like I can breathe again, quite honestly.
And we were talking about DMX's funeral, and I told you I had some folk up this weekend who were vaccinated from New York, and, social distancing and masked up and all that, but we had a great time. It was just good to see folks again. So anyway, I know we have to go, but listen, thank you for having us today. And you're amazing. Thanks for letting us into your life too. That was just a blessing for me personally. I watched you since our days with Soledad Bryant and all that. Glad that you're doing such a fascinating job. Thank you for asking us compelling questions, not something that was just run of mill. You pushed us. You pushed the doctor because, he's the one that had to answer all the questions. I was just his sidekick today. And I love being his sidekick because he's brilliant, talented. He's someone you can trust. And so for me, that's part of the first level of the measurement for making some step that could be life altering. Got to trust that person who's given this a blessing of knowledge that can pass it on to us. And so I've been fortunate to have a whole group of those folk convincing me for over a year now of the next steps. And so I appreciate them and I appreciate you for this window today.
And I appreciate both of you for your time. I do understand that both of you are extremely busy, and I would love to connect with the doctor that you referred earlier. And so if you could help us make that connection, I definitely would love to have him in the space and ask him some tough questions too. And I do appreciate, you guys could have said, listen, I'm not doing this with you. We're not doing this. If we're not talking and pushing the vaccine, we're not. So I do appreciate you stepping outside of the box and having these unorthodox conversations leading to universal consciousness. And so I just want to thank everybody who tuned in today. This will be replayed again tomorrow so that we can continue to push out the correct information for all of those that don't have access to make informed decisions. And so I am Tayla Andre, everything Tayla Andre, TaylaAndre. Please remember, if you are in need of a vaccine, you can go to the Black Boston COVID Coalition website. You can literally sign up on the website. You will get a call, and someone will schedule your appointment for you to get vaccinated, whether it's at the Reggie Lewis site or one of the mobile vaccine sites that the Black Boston COVID Coalition is working on. You can, if you need any type of wellness checks, Next Leadership Development is helping families out with gift cards and food baskets by way of Miss Shirley. If you're in need of any mask, and so that's Next Leadership Development Corporation, and you can, it's nextleads.org. You fill out that form, and somebody will give you a call and see if you're in need of a food basket or a gift card. And so again, everything Tayla Andre, TaylaAndre. I want you to make informed decisions that are right for you and your family, regardless of whatever that decision is. I thank you. I love you. I appreciate you. And I hope you have an amazing day.